আমরা আমাদের মূল অনুষ্ঠানে আসছি এবার। আমাদের এই মূল অনুষ্ঠানের প্রথম পর্বে থাকছে দুটি নিবন্ধ। একটি মূল নিবন্ধ, সেটি দেবেন ইতিহাসবিদ অধ্যাপক অমর ফারুকী, যিনি দিল্লি বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়ে থেকে গত বছর 2022 সালে অবসর নিয়েছেন। মাত্র গত বছর। অত্যন্ত অত্যন্ত পপুলার টিচার ছিলেন এবং জেনারেশন অফ স্টুডেন্টস ইন দিল্লি ইউনিভার্সিটি হ্যাভ অ্যাপ্রিসিয়েটেড হিজ ওয়ার্ক। এবং এত বড় একজন আনঅ্যাজুমিং স্কলার, তার এত প্রবন্ধ, এত বই রয়েছে, কিন্তু তিনি নিজেকে কখনো জাহির করেন না। নিজে সেন্ট স্টিফেন্স কলেজের ছাত্র ছিলেন, বাবা সেন্ট স্টিফেন্স কলেজের ছাত্র ছিলেন। 1941 সালে নেহেরুর অ্যারেস্টের প্রতিবাদ করার জন্য বাবা সেন্ট স্টিফেন্স কলেজ থেকে অপসারিত হন এবং স্বাধীনতার পরে তার ডিগ্রি ফেরত দেওয়া হয়। এবং জীবনের প্রথম পর্বে অমর ফারুকী হংসরাজ কলেজে পড়িয়েছিলেন, তারপরে দিল্লি বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়ে অধ্যাপক হিসেবে যোগ দেন। তার একাধিক বই রয়েছে। আর্লি সোশ্যাল ফরমেশনস একটা অনেক পুরনো বই। তাছাড়া তিনি বোম্বে সিটির ওপরে বই লিখেছেন। তাছাড়া তিনি ওপিয়ামের ওপরে কাজ করেছেন, তিনি পর্তুগিজ ট্রেডের ওপরে কাজ করেছেন, তিনি পপুলার হিস্ট্রি, যেটা পিপলস হিস্ট্রিতে তিনি আর্লি কলোনিয়াল রুল বলে বিখ্যাত বইটিও লিখেছেন। আরও অনেক প্রবন্ধ লিখেছেন এবং তিনি সর্বদা সজাগ একজন অধ্যাপক এবং তার ছাত্রছাত্রী মহলে অত্যন্ত সুনাম আছে, অত্যন্ত সুনাম আছে। এবং আমার মনে হয় যে আজকে যে ভাষণটি উনি এখানে ইংরেজিতে দেবেন, সেই ভাষণটি পরে আমরা বাংলা বার করব নিঃসন্দেহে, এবং সেই ভাষণটি শুনেও আপনারা সেইভাবে মোহিত হবেন। এছাড়া ওনার ভাষণের পরে আমরা প্রাচীন ভারত বিভাগের সভাপতির ভাষণটিও লাঞ্চ ব্রেকের আগে নেব। সুতরাং আমি প্রথমে I am requesting Professor Farooqui to come here and to speak, to present his presidential address. I hope 30-35 minutes is okay for you. Okay, sir. Thank you. Take this.
Thank you. Let me first apologize for not having the ability to speak in Bengali, and with the permission of the chair, I will make my presentation in English. Esteemed friends, I'm extremely grateful for having been given the opportunity to deliver the keynote address at the 39th annual conference of the Paschim Bang Itihas Sansad, and for the privilege of being in the midst of such a distinguished gathering of scholars. It is an honor for me to be part of this session of one of the most important organizations of historians in India and the main forum for professional historians in West Bengal, which over the past 46 years has contributed significantly to promoting scientific history. As a professional body of scholars associated with the discipline of history, the Itihas Sansad has been at the forefront of endeavors to develop the discipline in a direction that is not divisive or sectarian, but inclusive and secular. This is not an easy task, especially due to the long-term impact of colonial governance. At the same time, communal assertions which claim to be a form of history writing have perpetuated divisive narratives for purposes of political mobilization based on religious identities. I shall be offering some comments on one particular example of the overlap between colonial and communal narratives, namely the portrayal of the history of the Mughal era in a negative light. Such portrayal suited the purposes of officials of the East India Company sending their dispatches to their employers in London in the late 18th century, were incorporated in the so-called histories penned in the 19th century, such as those of James Mill and Mountstuart Elphinston, who were the pioneers, and were picked up in the closing decades of the century by that tendency in nationalist historiography which sought to glorify the ancient past, denigrate the medieval, and spoke of elite political and military conflicts with the Mughals in terms of a heroic struggle against foreigners. By the beginning of the 20th century, the building blocks of communal assertions about history were readily available for political mobilization. The view persists and is the staple of stories retailed by tourist guides at a large number of historical sites with which the Mughals were associated. Not that the guides bear the responsibility for distorting history. The source lies elsewhere, with the social media being a major channel for disseminating falsified versions. There is no need to recite the names of some of the prominent historical sites before distinguished scholars of history. These sites are where a great deal of popular history is manufactured, rendering the task of the professional historian so difficult. We are routinely urged to be skilled practitioners of the historian's craft, while at the same time simplifying our narratives, not always an easy task if the rigor of the discipline is not to be diluted. In the process of their political dealings with the Mughals during the 18th century, company officials produced the image of a decadent imperial court presided over by depraved and incompetent emperors of the post Aurangzeb period. Later accounts would depict, without any nuance, all emperors of the phase of decline as wretched and immoral. However, the last three emperors, Shah Alam, Akbar Shah, and Bahadur Shah, spanning the century from 1759 to 1857, were exceptionally dignified in their public demeanor, far removed from the stereotypical image of an effete oriental monarchy sunk in debauchery. They were thus able to distance themselves from some of the unsavory features of the reigns of their immediate predecessors, from Jahandar Shah to Alamgir II, appealing instead to the traditions of the great Mughals. These were traditions that had been considerably transformed during the first half of the 18th century, and under the prevailing historical conditions, they could scarcely have been replicated in substance. Their outward form, as well as some elements of their content, could nevertheless be suitably altered to redefine the limits and meaning of sovereignty. Shah Alam claimed sovereign authority over the bulk of the territories in the subcontinent, which had been part of the Mughal Empire at the end of the 17th century. But his understanding of sovereignty was accommodative of multiple centers of actual political power. The emperor's exercise of authority was eventually confined to legitimizing or withholding sanction to these centers of power. In that sense, the emperor's position was not confined to being the ruler, as Percival Spear suggests, of the kingdom of Delhi. Howsoever neat it might seem, such a term would have meant nothing to contemporaries, since there was no notion of such an entity. This was apparent as late as 1857 when Sipahis from contingents of the Bengal army stationed in Meerut mutinied on 10 May and then marched as a body to Delhi, where their immediate destination was the royal palace. Here they sought the blessings of Emperor Bahadur Shah for their cause. Their action has erroneously been interpreted as their having declared Bahadur Shah as emperor, which he already was insofar as the Sipahis were concerned. The emperor did indeed bless their cause and eventually paid a heavy price for his association with the rebels. It is an irony that in his political critique of colonial historiography on the revolt, and I emphasize the word political, the preeminent ideologue of Hindutva, V.D. Savarkar, gave a favorable account of Bahadur Shah's role in it. Although, as a history of the revolt, the work has its problems, the point is that Savarkar did not consider it worthwhile to belittle the symbolic significance of the Mughal emperor's place in constitutional arrangements prevailing on the eve of the revolt, despite, as some scholars have argued, the worldview of the book prefiguring many of the ideas Savarkar was to articulate later on. What I propose to speak about in a little detail today is inspired by the address delivered by Professor Sabyasachi Bhattacharya as General President of the Indian History Congress exactly 20 years ago. The presidential address was entitled Colonial State, Theory and Practice. One of the key themes of the address was the theory of sovereignty as it evolved in the age of colonial expansion. Professor Bhattacharya examined the shifts that occurred during the 19th century, which, and I quote, theoretically allowed European powers to deny some rights and privileges under international law to non-European sovereign and semi-sovereign political entities. He went on to underline that, and I quote again, the legitimation of colonial states' authority was accompanied by the delegitimation of pre-colonial authority at levels ranging from the pre-colonial claimants to sovereignty to lower levels such as the native princes, chiefs, and the like. In the case of the Mughals, the process of delegitimation reached its climacteric moment at the trial of Bahadur Shah II. Unquote. What follows is an attempt to understand the implications which the trial, and throughout the text, the word trial is in inverted commas, the implications which the trial had in terms of the question of sovereignty. Given that colonial historiography of the period after the revolt erased the history of the relationship between the East India Company and the Mughal emperor, especially in the period from 1803 to 1857, so that the emperor could be regarded as a pensioner of the company, it might be instructive to look at a few aspects of this relationship. As the company extended its territorial control at the beginning of the 19th century to what had been the core areas of the Mughal Empire, the company found it expedient to fit itself into the imperial framework and thereby seek legitimacy for its rule. It reluctantly recognized the de jure authority of the Mughals and adhered to the ceremonial of the Mughal court till at least the late 1840s. In 1803, British forces led by Gerard Lake had entered Delhi after defeating the troops of Daulat Rao Scindia fighting on behalf of the emperor. The emperor's direct authority was henceforth confined to the Red Fort and to members of the royal family. Several hundred members of the extended family resided within the fort. Actual administrative control over Delhi and the surrounding areas passed into the hands of the company's resident. One would like to emphasize that respect was shown for the emperor's majesty right up to 1857. British officials strictly adhered to court etiquette. They had to dismount at some distance from the Diwane arm of the palace and approach the interior on foot. Only high officials, mainly the resident, had access to the emperor. Entry beyond the Diwane arm was a special privilege and was strictly by invitation. When one of the residents posted in Delhi, Francis Hawkins, who was resident from 1829 to 31, was discourteous to Akbar Shah, he was promptly recalled. While admonishing Hawkins for his conduct, the Calcutta authorities declared, and this is significant, that he had been wanting in the proper observance of the established forms of etiquette, to which all natives of rank attach much importance and which are peculiarly due from the British representative towards the royal family at Delhi. Besides, Nazr, or token tribute, was presented to the emperor on behalf of the company on important occasions. The offering of Nazr signified that the company's officials acknowledged the overlordship of the Mughal emperor. Nazr on behalf of the Governor General was presented on several formal occasions every year. There were about 7 occasions when Nazr was presented at formal darbars, the most prominent being the anniversary of the accession of the emperor, the 2 Eids, Nowroz, Dasehra, and Basant. A strict hierarchy was maintained in the amount of Nazr that was presented. Apart from the 101 gold mohars on behalf of the Governor General, 51 gold mohars were presented on behalf of the Commander in Chief and 21 gold mohars by the resident. The Governor General's Nazr was discontinued in the early 1820s. Nevertheless, other officials, including the resident, continued to offer Nazr down to 1844. When the company's officials in India decided to stop offering of Nazr in 1844, the decision was overruled by the Court of Directors in London, though this was never conveyed to the emperor. He was reluctantly compensated by being paid the monetary equivalent of the resident's Nazr as part of his peshkash, which emptied the payment of all symbolic significance. There was no substantial alteration in the relationship between the mid-1840s and the outbreak of the revolt. For over 4 months, from 11 May 1857 onwards, Delhi was governed by the Sipahi regime, nominally headed by Bahadur Shah. The British re-established control over the city and its environs by the end of September. In early 1858, the British invoked martial law and charged the reigning emperor, and I say reigning emperor for he had not formally surrendered or transferred sovereignty. Bahadur Shah had been in Delhi in British captivity since the reconquest of Delhi. The Mughal emperor, now referred to as the ex-king of Delhi, was put on trial 4 months after the British reconquest of Delhi. This sham show lasting from 27 January to 9 March 1858, was conducted by what was designated as a European Military Commission. The martial law invoked by the company was that of England, the authorization for which was provided by the company's charter. It is a different matter that even in the case of England at this time, martial law was not based on settled principles. Martial law was initially proclaimed in the wake of rebellion in Meerut and subsequently extended to a large part of the subcontinent. It was ultimately based on the draconian provisions of Bengal Regulation 10 of 1804. In the words of Troy Downs, who has an important study on this martial law, on this regulation, the importance of Regulation 10 for the maintenance of British rule in India accounted for its long-standing presence on the colonial statute books, with its statutory powers remaining in force for more than a century. As an extreme and well entrenched instrument of state violence, it had the capacity to inflict widespread death and destruction because it seemingly combined both law, Regulation 10's legal powers that overrode ordinary criminal law, and lawlessness, that is, the physical operation of martial law as carried out by the military. David Desenhaus, in his essay on what he calls the puzzle of martial law, namely that the state, that is, the officials who act in its name, is legally authorized to act without any legal controls, notes that martial law was an indispensable instrument for upholding colonial interests. He perceptively remarks that, quote, one way of conceiving empire was as a raw projection of power, in the sense of power unmediated by law. But however the advocates of empire conceived what it was to govern through law, they saw no option but so to govern in part because governing through law legitimized empire. Orders for setting up the military commission to try Bahadur Shah had been issued by John Lawrence, Chief Commissioner of Punjab, under Act 14 of June 1857. The Act provided for the trial and punishment of certain offences relating to the army and of offences against the state. The tribunal comprised 5 members, the minimum required under the Act, with Lieutenant Colonel Dawes as president and 4 other members. 3 of these 4 members held the rank of major and 1 of captain. The opening statement at the trial by the Deputy Judge Advocate General, Major F.J. Harriet, repudiated the long history of the East India Company's acknowledgement of the Mughal emperor as de jure sovereign. And I quote from that charge sheet, for that he, being a subject of the British government of India, so already he is declared a subject of the British government of India. There's no reference in the charge sheet to the company, British government of India, and not regarding the duty of his allegiance, did at Delhi on the 11th May 1857 or thereabouts, as a false traitor against the state, proclaim and declare himself the reigning king and sovereign of India, and did then and there traitorously seize and take unlawful possession of the city of Delhi, and did moreover at various times between the 10th of May and 1st of October 1857, as such false traitor aforesaid, treasonably conspire, consult, and agree with Mirza Mughal, his own son, and with Muhammad Bakht Khan, Subedar of the regiment of artillery, one of the main military leaders of the revolt, and diverse other false traitors unknown to raise, levy, and make insurrection, rebellion, and war against the state, and further to fulfill and perfect his treasonable design of overthrowing and destroying the British government in India, did assemble armed forces at Delhi and send them forth to fight and wage war against the said British government. The military commission, so this was from the charge sheet, the military commission delivered the verdict that the prisoner Muhammad Bahadur Shah, ex-king of Delhi, is guilty of all and every part of the charges preferred against him. He was sentenced to transportation along with Zeenat Mahal, that is his wife, and two of his sons, Jawan Bakht and Shah Abbas. Shah Abbas was Bahadur Shah's second youngest son. The three of them, that is Zeenat Mahal, Shah Abbas, and Jawan Bakht, were never put on trial, even in the phony sense that the emperor was. For 7 months, and yet they were sort of sentenced, the same sentence was passed on them. For 7 months after the conclusion of the trial, the four prisoners remained incarcerated in Delhi. In the first week of October 1858, they were sent to British Burma, reaching Rangoon by the end of the year. The four prisoners were accompanied by Jawan Bakht's wife, Nawab Shah Zamani Begum, Shah Abbas's mother, Mubarakun Nisa Begum, and a few attendants, two of whom had small children with them. Shah Zamani Begum, Mubarakun Nisa, and the attendants had made, and again I quote from the official document, had made their own election to follow the state prisoners after having been made clearly to understand that while they remain with the prisoners, they will be subjected to precisely the same restraints as those which will be imposed upon the prisoners themselves. So they also lived in captivity in Rangoon. The exile of the emperor, his physical removal from mainland India, was integral to the process of delegitimizing the Mughals. In Rangoon, the royal family was kept in strict confinement within the compound of the British military cantonment. There might have been vague rumors about Bahadur Shah's presence in the city, but local inhabitants had no precise information. When, 4 years later, Zafar passed away, it was easy for Captain Nelson Davies, the official in charge of the royal prisoners, to organize a quiet funeral, burying his body in an unmarked grave. It was later remarked that even though a handful of Muslims from the neighborhood were allowed to be present at the funeral to render it sufficiently public, they had no notion of its significance. And again, I quote from the official document about this. This circumstance has been ascribed to the incredulity of the native population of Rangoon, who never could be brought to believe that the miserable and half-witted old man in confinement and exile was really the ex-emperor of Delhi, whose predecessors had ruled all over India, from Kabul to Kashmir and Kachar to Chittagong. Bahadur Shah's health had deteriorated rapidly after his arrival in Rangoon. In November 1858, he had been examined by a committee of medical officers at Allahabad en route to Burma, and the committee had reported that, allowing for the natural functional decay attending his advanced age, the committee considered that his general physical condition is good beyond what they anticipated to find, and he is hale and vigorous for his age and free from organic disease. In fact, even at 80, Bahadur Shah was a very, very sort of fit person in terms of his health. Zafar was then 83 years old. Within a short span of time, he was bedridden. So soon after he reached Rangoon. He was so weak that he felt it an exertion even to swallow his food. The popular image of a dejected poet emperor encouraging his subjects from his place of exile to continue the struggle against the British is based on wishful thinking. By the end of October 1862, Bahadur Shah's condition was reported to be critical. His throat was affected and it was very difficult to get broth down even in small quantities. All this while, Bahadur Shah's attendant, Ahmad Beg, was constantly at his bedside with no one else to assist him. On the 5th, the civil surgeon pronounced that Bahadur Shah would not survive many days. The next day, he was seized with a kind of paralytic attack and passed away at about 5 a.m. on Friday, 7 November 1862. It was a measure of the success of the colonial state's attempt to render invisible the ex-royal family of Delhi, as the Mughal family was referred to in post-1857 colonial records, that public interest in his fortunes waned rapidly during the 1860s. In any case, the ruthless suppression of the revolt ensured that no one was likely to take the risk of inquiring into the conditions of the royal family in distant Burma or of establishing contact with it. There were, of course, popular legends about Bahadur Shah, and these are later legends, by the way. There were, of course, popular legends about Bahadur Shah, the poet emperor, composing melancholic verses in Rangoon. But there was little by way of hard facts. After the demise of the ex-king of Delhi, colonial officials too lost interest in the family. Members of the exiled family continued to be classified as, as state prisoners of the first rank. The principal, that is the official classification, the principal state prisoners of the British Indian Empire, till the death in the mid-1880s of Jawan Bakht and Zeenat Mahal. In March 1870, James Talboys Wheeler, secretary to the chief commissioner of British Burma, took charge of the imperial family. Wheeler realized that the surviving members of the Mughal royal family had been completely forsaken by colonial officialdom. In fact, there was a consensus by this time that there should be no reference to the family even in routine correspondence between Rangoon and Calcutta. Shortly after assuming office, Wheeler prepared a detailed note on the conditions of the prisoners. There were now 3 state prisoners in Rangoon: Zeenat Mahal, Jawan Bakht and Shah Abbas, who were part of the original group of exiles. As late as 1865, an addition was made to the list of state prisoners when yet another son of Bahadur Shah was sent to Rangoon. This was the unfortunate Kochak Sultan, who has been condemned to even greater obscurity than the other prisoners, since he does not figure in the original list and is therefore missing from historical accounts as well. The circumstances of Kochak Sultan's transportation highlight the relentlessness with which the colonial state pursued its policy of obliterating vestiges of the memory of the Mughals. Kochak Sultan had been captured along with other members of the royal family after the British reoccupied Delhi, but managed to escape and remained in hiding till he was apprehended in Jaipur in 1862. He was immediately put on trial and convicted. The main charge, and I'm quoting from his trial, the judgment in the trial, he was immediately put on trial and convicted. The main charge brought against him was that he was appointed to the command of a regiment of mutineers and that he held the command for about a week. This was a specific charge. It was irrelevant for the purpose of the case that Kochak Sultan was a lad of just 15 at the time of the revolt. He was, as might have been expected, sentenced to transportation at the end of the trial. However, he languished, virtually forgotten, in the Delhi jail for 3 years before a decision was taken to send him to Rangoon. At the beginning of the 1870s, another part of the story of Mughal exile suddenly came to light. This was a story that seems to have been concealed so effectively thus far that senior officials were themselves somewhat taken by surprise. In 1872, the House of Lords received a petition from a member of the royal family exiled in the remote Burmese town of Schwegen. The petition originated from Mirza Ali Qadr, a nephew of Bahadur Shah. Ali Qadr was a grandson of Akbar Shah. The petition stated that Ali Qadr had been transported to Burma because he was allegedly connected in some way with the events of 1857 in Delhi. No specific charge had ever been brought against him, nor had his participation in the revolt been established. Having dumped him in Schwegen, the British Indian government had completely forgotten about his existence. Ali Qadr asserted in his petition that he had nothing whatsoever to do with the rebels. He had remained in hiding throughout the revolt, and when the British troops captured the city, he was compelled and driven by the reckless and vengeful fury of the British army to follow the steps of other fugitives to seek safety out of Delhi. He subsequently surrendered at Panipat, was tried by a military commission, and sentenced to transportation in June 1858. All that was held against him was that he was a member of the royal family and was present in Delhi during the rebellion. So by now, this is all that is required to convict. In his petition, he pleaded, and I quote, for the granting of a free pardon for any and every offense, if any, that may have been imputed to him. Drawing attention to the plight of Ali Qadr during the debate on the petition, there was a brief debate on this petition in the House of Lords. Drawing attention to the plight of Ali Qadr during the debate on the petition in the House of Lords, the Earl of Derby, who had been president of the Board of Control and was the first Secretary of State for India in 1858-59, in the Tory ministry at that time, that's 1858-59, pointed out that no charge, so this is Lord Derby speaking in the House of Lords, that no charge was made against the petitioner either then or afterwards, and that the officer conducting the inquiry before whom he was examined admitted as much, but said, and this is what the military officer said, but said that as a relation of the ex-king of Delhi, it was necessary that he should be sent out of India. He was accordingly kept in confinement in the jails successively of Agra, Allahabad and Alipur. He was then sent to the Andaman Islands, where several of his companions died on the way from the rigor of their imprisonment, and subsequently to British Burma, where he now is. He further affirms, this is Lord Derby speaking, he further affirms that he has never been informed of the nature of the offenses imputed to him and believes there is nothing against him beyond the facts of his being the nephew of the ex-king and being in Delhi when the rebels held it. So as we shall see now, policy is that that is sufficient to convict. The official correspondence that Ali Qadr's case gave rise to would suggest that for more than a decade, the colonial state deliberately pursued a policy of making no public acknowledgement of the presence of several Mughal exiles in Burma and perhaps elsewhere. The resurfacing of Ali Qadr caused no embarrassment or pangs of conscience. Rather, it provided an opportunity to concretize a comprehensive hardline policy towards the Mughal prisoners of war, cynically articulated by C.U. Acheson, who was at that time secretary in the foreign department. And this is Acheson's note, in which he says, however insufficient the evidence may appear at this distance of time to bring individual guilt, so it's not a question of individual guilt. However insufficient the evidence may appear at this distance of time to bring individual guilt home to individual persons, it must be remembered that the conduct of the Delhi family as a body was so notoriously hostile, and their participation in the murders and atrocities perpetrated was so general, that the two facts, first, of belonging to the family, and second, having been in the city throughout the siege, were considered sufficient evidence to justify the inference that the person identified himself with the rebel cause. So this is now the official policy. Acheson, however, was echoing the view of John Lawrence, who was now a member of the House of Lords and had been commissioner, subsequently viceroy. Intervening in the debate, he stated that, so actually it's an interesting debate, because the Secretary of State actually replying to the Lord Derby's statement about the petition actually says, I don't have any papers, I can't remember anything. So since John Lawrence is here, perhaps he will recall this case and tell us something about it. And John Lawrence also said, I don't remember this case, but then he makes a particular formulation. Acheson was echoing the view of Lawrence, now a member of the House of Lords. Intervening in the debate, he stated, that's Lawrence, that in dealing with these cases, it was only just to remember the horrid atrocities that were committed. Further, that bearing in mind what these men did, that's members of the royal family, and what would be the evil effects of allowing them to come back to Hindustan, it would be an unwise and injudicious course to permit them to return to India. So that's sort of policy that he takes, and that's what then is found in Acheson's note. In the wake of the petition, inquiries were made to determine the exact number of such exiles. It was discovered that there were 9 prisoners at various locations in Burma, besides the 4 at Rangoon. 2 more, excluding Zafar, had already expired. There were another 2 at Karachi in Sindh. All these exiles were in receipt of paltry allowances between 18 and 25 rupees per month from the local authorities. Zeenat Mahal and Jawan Bakht were the only prisoners who received a relatively large sum, respectively 250 rupees and 300 rupees. Kochak Sultan and Shah Abbas got 35 rupees each. It is likely that there might have been other exiles who did not receive a pension and therefore do not figure in colonial records. Jawan Bakht died in 1884 of cirrhosis of liver, jaundice and dropsy in the Burmese town of Moulmein, where he had been allowed to go to convalesce. He had become an alcoholic in captivity. Zeenat Mahal passed away in July 1886. She had been struck by an attack of colic of some severity in 1884, and again in November 1885. She had an illness lasting for about a month, suffering from similar symptoms which nearly terminated fatally. Zeenat Mahal had been addicted to opium for nearly 17 years in exile, consuming as much as 10 grains, that's about 650 milligrams of the drug in 24 hours, generally considered a fairly high dose. Shah Zamani Begum, that's the wife of Jawan Bakht, had lost her sight, not having been allowed to avail of medical treatment in Calcutta. Travel was refused to her. Her miserable existence came to an end in July 1899. So that marks the end of this sort of immediate family and its exile. The conventional view on the question of sovereignty has been that the Charter Act of 1813 proclaimed sovereignty of the British Crown over the company's territorial possessions in India. And this had been recognized by European powers in the 1814 Treaty of Paris. More recently, it has been argued that acquisitions of the company since the 17th century, and I'm citing the work of my colleague Rahul Govind, who's just published a book on this subject recently. More recently, it has been argued that acquisitions of the company since the 17th century were sanctioned by the authority of the English king to make war and peace, which in turn was based on prize laws with roots in naval prize distribution, the sharing of plunder and booty on the seas. The subcontinent was thus fixed in a permanent state of martial law, while the British Isles were not. As early as 1756-57, the king's law officers had emphasized, when opinion was sought in the context of the recapture of Calcutta in January 1857, that is before the Battle of Plassey, that all conquests as such were vested with His Majesty, as did specific goods and items acquired therein. The company received authorization to make war and peace as subject of the king. So much for the status of the company in relation to the king. Its status within India was complicated by the authorization it sought and received from the Mughal emperor. The matter was still unresolved when Bahadur Shah was put on trial. In an important essay published in 1922, F.W. Buckler argued persuasively that the source of the company's authority in India lay not in the charters of the King of England, nor in the acts of the British Parliament, nor in the sword, but in the farmans of the Mughal emperor. Buckler's views were largely ignored. Douglas Dever and H.L. Garrett published a critique rubbishing his argument, underlining the powerlessness of the Mughal emperors of the early 19th century. Buckler's understanding challenged the common sense in colonial historiography of the post-revolt period about the political role of the last three Mughal emperors. It was embarrassing after 1857-58 to recognize the relationship between the East India Company and the emperor, wherein there was an acknowledgement of the sovereignty of the Mughals. The history of the relationship was completely erased. In standard textbook accounts, Bahadur Shah remains a pensioner of the British government in India, which is how he was described during the trial. In his 2016 study, the same title as his presidential address, Colonial State Theory and Practice, in his 2016 study on the colonial state and processes of legitimation, Sabyasachi Bhattacharya observes that the stout defense of the imperial point of view by Devar and Garrett completely misses the point made by Buckler, that the point at issue is who was the de jure sovereign, there being no question about the situation of the powerless House of Timur since 1803, nor about the superior coercive power exercised by the East India Company. Victoria's proclamation issued in November 1858, and I'm coming to the end of my address. Victoria's proclamation issued in November 1858, following the Act of August 1858, was an assertion of the sovereignty of the crown over the Indian Empire. It declared that all inhabitants of the East India Company's territories, which were now directly to be governed by the British government, were subjects of the crown, though subsequent deliberations, especially in the context of the amnesty provisions of the proclamation, made it clear that what was available to Indians was an inferior subjecthood, not equivalent to that of European British subjects. The arraignment and trial of Bahadur Shah had coincided with the with the launch of a major military offensive by the British against the rebels who had overthrown the company's regime in large parts of northern, central, and eastern India. It took the British nearly 8 to 9 months after the offensive was launched to restore their authority in what had effectively been liberated zones. The trial seems to have been an afterthought and was primarily a propaganda exercise. The company could easily have taken punitive action against Bahadur Shah, even execution, without the fuss of a trial. The ruthless military occupation of Delhi made it unlikely that someone might intervene to demand justice for the emperor. The proceedings conducted within the royal palace in the Diwan-e-Khas, where Bahadur Shah and his predecessors had held their special darbars, was intended to send a message to rebels who had pledged their loyalty to the emperor that their actions had no legitimacy whatsoever. Public memory is short. 20 years later, the English Queen's Indian subjects had once again to be reminded that Victoria, now styled Kaisar-e-Hind, the Indian Caesar, was their sovereign. I am referring to the imperial assemblage of Delhi held in 1877. And yet, for the tens of thousands who perished in the famine of that year, that's 1877, such a government could have no legitimacy. I would like to conclude by quoting William Digby's censure of the extravagant festivities of the Darbar, 1877 Darbar, amid starvation and death. And I quote, India is a land of startling contrasts, but extremes were never more vividly noted than in the scenes which were being witnessed on the plains of Delhi in the north and in the districts of the south, where this famine was the most severe, in the early days of January 1877. The spectacular splendor of the imperial assemblage surpassed anything of the kind the continent had known. The field of cloth and gold was not more magnificent. Whilst preparations were being made for the proclamation of Her Majesty the Queen of Great Britain as Empress of India, and whilst ceremonies were actually in progress, 65,000 subjects of the Queen Empress died of starvation and the diseases caused by insufficient nourishment in Madras Presidency alone. Unquote. Sentiments of loyalty can scarcely be expected from hungry women and men whose means of subsistence have been snatched from them to pay for such grand public displays of power, though they might not immediately have the ability to express their resentment and anger. Thank you for your patience.